Hello, my name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. Welcome to another episode of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. Today I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Arnold Cantu. Hi, Arnold. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, you bet. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. You're a clinical social worker and a psychotherapist in Fort Collins, Colorado, and you work with community mental health with children, adolescents, families, and individuals. And you're also the lead editor in the Ethics International Press for a series of volumes that examine the psychiatric model of treatment and diagnostic labeling and propose practical alternatives. And you've also fairly recently published an article in the Journal of Teaching and Social Work titled A Case for Intellectual Humility, Tolerance, and Humanism, Perspectives from an Ethnically Minoritized, and you put minoritized in quotation marks, graduate student. And I'll put a link to this article in the description below. And basically, you tell your story about how critical social justice activism has taken over the teaching and training and caring professions like social work and psychotherapy. And this comes directly out of your experience in a doctoral program in social work, right?
That's right. That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did I get your details right? Is anything you want
Yeah.
to add? Or, yeah, okay. All right.
Yeah. That's pretty much
Um,
sums me up.
okay. Well, I'm eager for my listeners to hear your story. I find there are still people who think this is made up, think it's, some kind of exaggeration or some kind of conspiracy theory from right-wing ideologues who just don't like, social justice. I think those people are in the minority now, but it's really useful to have a very personal, direct, concrete example of this. It makes it real. Um, but before here, you look like you want to say something. No?
No, I was gonna similarly. I think there have been maybe a handful of folks I've shared my article with who are now in academia, or maybe they're just kind of in private practice or something, and some of them are just kind of like, this is kind of unbelievable. But yeah, it's become more of the minority now, I think, at least in my
Yeah,
case, that most people do have some exposure to these kinds of ideas.
yeah, yeah. Well, before hearing your story, I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about your background, where you come from, what your previous experiences have been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was born in Mexico, and then I grew up in South Texas, so the very, very southern tip of Texas, which people always think, oh, San Antonio or El Paso. No, way further south than that, as south as you can get. So it's a border area that I grew up in, predominantly Hispanic population. My parents immigrated to the States. So I grew up there, did my undergrad there. Still consider South Texas home for sure. My parents still live there, so and my brother and his family, so I visit them once in a while. And
I see.
then did grad school in Austin, Texas. And this is an interesting part, something I try to also make a comparison to. I lived in the what would typically consider like the pretty liberal bubble of Texas, that's Austin, and
Hmm.
10 years ago, and it was a wildly different experience than it was when I was in grad school this recent time, and that was just 10 years ago in Austin. um I think, I mean, there was still some pretty more social justice or progressive kind of ideas thrown around throughout the city. Some, if there was any kind of like grassroots efforts, things like that, that was still a thing, but very much tempered compared to how things are now. Hey, Soka, told you she was gonna be probably back and forth.
Yeah.
She probably found a squirrel over there. And so I did grad school there. I stuck around there for a few years after to work as a school social worker in a charter school there, which is also kind of an interesting thing because I think for some reason within this critical social justice ethos, charter schools get a bad rap for some reason. Um,
Okay.
I don't know. I haven't dug so much into the criticisms of charter schools and why people don't like them, but they think the reasons tend to be not the most compelling. Anyway, worked there for a few years as the school social worker for a middle school. Loved it. Fifth through eighth
Mm-hmm.
grade. I was the one person there as like the sole mental health professional. Um, and then I met my partner, my significant other, around that time, and we moved out to Albuquerque after that. Worked in community mental health there as well for a clinic affiliated with the hospital. Love that work
Mm-hmm.
too. It was only
Uh-huh.
kids at that point, kids and teenagers, adolescents.
Mm-hmm.
Um, did that for a few years, and then that's when I had the interest in going to a doctoral program. Uh, uh, I think when you said earlier about the books I've been helping be a lead editor on, that's been my interest as far as like the medical model of mental health. So at
Mm-hmm.
that point, I was kind of in the belly of the beast of in a clinic
Mm-hmm.
setting, have to use diagnoses because if you want insurance, Medicaid to cover
Mm-hmm.
services, they need that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I started to see firsthand my own conflict, my own cognitive dissonance of, I have to use these labels that for some people they're absolute truth. For me, I think I know quite a bit more of the history surrounding them and why they're very controversial. Yeah, I have to use them and at the same time navigate, in some ways I'm telling the story of a kid and family by applying these labels. Yeah, I know their story is more complex than that. And so it was this conflict I had for a few
Yep.
years. And then I decided, I can either keep bitching about this to colleagues who would hear me out or go back to school and try to do something about it. And so that's when
Mm-hmm.
I think it was
Okay.
the pandemic 2020, I
All
applied
right.
to grad school
All
and
right.
then made the move up in 2022 to Fort
Okay.
Collins from Albuquerque. And I'm still here.
All right.
I
All right.
love it here. It's pretty awesome.
So, okay. Thank you. Two curiosities. One is initially what inspired you or motivated you to get into social work, and um, also the motivation to go to grad school sounds like it was it was almost an activist kind of motivation in a sense. You wanted to challenge the system, but as we'll hear, your particular brand was not
The right one.
welcome. Yeah, but yeah, why did you want to become a social worker? What was in
Like
your
from
in
the
your heart?
beginning,
Yeah, yeah.
that pure chance. It was pure chance. When I was back in undergrad in South Texas, I at that point I kind of just had a hunch or a feeling, I do want to end up in some kind of counseling therapist role. I mean, I was what, 21 or so. I didn't know yet what were the disciplines or paths or licensures that could lead you to that role. And so it was pure chance. I was, I think, my last year of undergrad. I was at that point already considering or strongly leaning towards staying in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley for a master's in, I think, clinical psychology at the same university I was doing my undergrad in, because I didn't know what else there was. And so, pure chance, I walk out of class one day. It was probably my senior year of undergrad. There's a graduate school resource fair there. UT Austin happens to have a table, and it's a representative from the school of social work. And
Mm-hmm.
I walked up. I loved the Longhorns growing up. I love watching them football, the Vince Young days. And I walked up and asked them about what they offer. And this entire time, I mean, it's purely just being uninformed. This entire time, I associated social work with CPS, which I think a lot of people do. You think of Child Protective Services, you think of,
Yeah.
well, it's a
Mm-hmm.
social worker who typically comes to your
Sure.
home. That was still my impression. So I chatted up the recruiter. He asked, do you want to do research? Do you want to do something more applied? And at that point, it was purely just I wanted to get in the field and actually try to learn some clinical skills. And so he mentioned their master's program. I went home, did a little bit more research of like what really is social work, which is actually a pretty um, interesting story as it is, because I think it's still it's okay. I think it's still a profession that, as I write in my article, it's still a profession that's still we're not sure what it really is. Like, is it
All
a
right.
science base? Is it a
Yeah.
practice base? Is it
Right.
what is it just in
Well,
service?
yeah. I
Uh,
think you mentioned in your article somebody saying it's not even a profession; it's something else.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What are we? And so, um, which I think kind of actually, now I think about it, it kind of coincides a bit with the discipline of psychiatry. I think that one as well, we can get to that later. That one also goes through its crises every so generation. So I think they're also similarly trying to figure out what is it that we are we medicine or not? Anyway, and so I did research a little bit on what social work was, and in the grand scheme of things, I learned that that is one path that you can take 2 years of a grad program to be licensed and practice as a clinician. And so I went for it. I applied to a couple other programs, but I I grew up loving the Longhorns, and so if I could do a master's there, why
Okay.
not? So I
All
went
right.
for it.
Okay. Well, thanks.
So,
Thanks. So you enroll in a doctoral program, and you bring your inspiration about how you want to challenge psychiatric or medical model treatment, and because you've had some direct experience with the stories and the suffering of the people you're working with, for whom that language and that conceptual frame just doesn't fit, and you've got this cognitive dissonance. So you go into the doctoral program to learn, and you encounter something. And that's what you're going to tell us about.
way to build up the suspense. Yeah, and to be fair, I linked up with this school with Colorado State University, their social work program, because at least what I've gathered in just learning about doctoral programs is part of it is the location, but you really want to be able to connect with an advisor who can support your interests and is on board. And
Mm-hmm.
so I did. I had found a professor there who is similar minded, reached out to this individual. Shared my interest. This person encouraged me to apply. And so I applied. At that point, it's really interesting. I don't know if something happened drastically during my time there, but I'm just thinking back, even just applying was fairly tempered also. My
Okay.
personal statement
What
and
year was
reference.
that? What year was that, Arnold?
If I when I applied, I probably applied, I believe 2020, end of
Okay.
2020 to
All right.
start 2021, I believe, if I remember correctly.
All right.
So
Okay.
even then, it was still like and at least the way I answered my own reasons why I wanted to go to a grad program in my personal statement, there wasn't anything they didn't take any issue with that. I'm sure I could find my
Ah,
personal statement back in the
and
day.
you
Um,
didn't make any grand claims about social justice or inequality and oppression, and you didn't
no,
trumpet
and
all of those messages, which are now pretty well expected, right?
well, and if I did, which I think I probably hinted at it, if I did, I tied it to the medical model, and
Right.
that was my spiel for the whole my shtick for the whole 3 years there. That's my angle is this in my view the medical model being pretty oppressive and unfair and unscientific. That's what I didn't went into arguing and got accepted. But apparently that's not. They didn't take issue with that. They
Right.
took
Okay.
issue with.
All
And we
right.
could get to that. Yeah.
So you got under the radar somehow, or the radar hadn't been turned on quite full strength yet, and you got in.
Yeah. I got in, no issue. Small cohort, 6 or 7 of us, and it was good for the first, year or so with no major
Uh-huh.
issues.
Okay. Drum roll, please.
Do you want me to drive? Okay.
And then
Yeah, so it was 2021, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I was there for 3 years. 2021, I started, no issues. Um, when was it? Fall of 2022, going into winter, I reach out to one professor asking for a letter of recommendation to apply for a fellowship. A fellowship just being, another way to make some income because grad
Mm-hmm.
students typically are poor. Um, so I reached out to this professor. This professor had taught a class already that I was in, so this professor had an idea of my interest and writing abilities and things like that. So I reach out to this professor. I say, can you be a reference? This professor says, sure, send me your CV and your personal statement for the fellowship so I can craft a letter of recommendation. Send it over. My personal statement. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. This fellowship is geared towards supporting um, applicants that fall under the minority umbrella, which now in hindsight, maybe I don't even know if I would even want to apply for something like that anymore. But um, I considered myself in the minority, and it's geared towards, if I remember correctly, folks who fall under the minority umbrella to support disenfranchised or disadvantaged populations. Most of my career has been working with low income Hispanic folks, um, immigrant population, things like that. The charter school I worked at, 95 or 90 plus, 90% plus, 95% plus of the student body qualified for free or reduced lunch. That's always a criteria to know,
Mm-hmm.
how low income that population is. So I tailor my personal statement to this fellowship to speak to that not only are my interests aligned, my research interests aligned with, trying to find replacements to this medical model, but also how it coincides with working in the clinic that seeing uh, unique barriers to the immigrant population. You have language barriers when you have Hispanic or primarily Spanish speaking people seeking services. You have power imbalances, that the if I have an immigrant mother who's seeking support for her daughter and I am in this role of like the professional, there are power imbalances there that I think are very unique to that setting. Then there's language barriers, other things. There's the immigration or the resident status where if I work with somebody who is undocumented and there's a risk of like I need to get CPS involved, that's a unique issue where for some families, although they probably want that, they I would have conversations with some clients of if you call CPS, am I going to get deported? Things like very unique circumstances. So I write about this in my personal statement for this fellowship, send it
Mm-hmm.
off to this professor. Professor basically says, "You know what? Let's just have coffee after the new year to talk about this some more." So I enter my winter break with this being like, this is kind of weird. I thought this would be a slam dunk. I enter my
Mm-hmm.
winter break of 2022, entering 2023, kind of down a dumps already. I'm like, this is kind of weird. Why do I need to talk to this professor? Anyway, so 2023 rolls around and this professor and I have coffee. It's right after the new year. And for a good at least 2 hours, I am drilled about how I'm not taking the profession's values seriously, that this professor has concerns about me as a student, my standing, um, outright asks me like, do you not believe in like structural oppression, systemic racism, all the buzzwords that are typically thrown around. And I'm kind of blown away for a good 2, 3 hours because I'm
All
just
right.
like, what the hell's going on?
And
And so, go ahead.
was well was his position that because of the absence of certain language in your proposal,
In the essay.
that made you unfit, or was there any other evidence that somehow you just weren't up for the task? I mean,
Yeah, so that's one of them. When I write in my article, I play the religious role where that I know of I committed 3 sins. That was one of them. It sounds like that I didn't attend to the usual oppressor oppressed
right,
issues in that essay.
sin of omission.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So I'm sitting down with this professor. That's one thing that gets pointed out that's an issue, that I didn't attend to those issues in particular in this essay. Okay.
Hmm.
What I found out in that same meeting was that in the prior fall semester, fall 2022, I had taken two other social work classes. In one of these social work classes, we had to create, for the sake of an assignment, an anti-oppressive research proposal. I don't have any issue with anti-oppressive. Again, I think for me, the medical model is oppressive, and I want to be able to develop anti-oppressive models. Anyway, so I do this assignment. Again, this is fall 2022 before this meeting. This is this research proposal for this assignment. What we read some of the literature of anti-oppressive research. Some of it makes sense to me. Some of it is a bit too much, or just like it's wait, it just doesn't make sense to me. Some of it doesn't. And so what I did, just for the sake of an assignment, is what I did, it was instead of getting caught up in the weeds of this anti-oppressive literature, that a lot of it is just nonsensical, I just defined anti-oppressive using the
Oh, yeah,
Oxford
yeah.
English Dictionary.
Uh-huh,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I
I
did
remember
that.
reading that, yeah.
Yeah, I defined it using the dictionary. I did my presentation to my peers and my professor. I think I got
Can, and
a
you were accused of being disingenuous, I believe I read. And then you
right.
said
Yeah.
it would be disingenuous of me to, just go with this definition that, or this understanding of it that I don't really agree with. That's what would be
Yeah.
disingenuous. Yeah.
Right, it would be just yeah, so I did the presentation. I think I got perfect score on it, no issues. And that professor apparently had spoken to this other professor I'm having coffee with. That was count number two, sin number two that I had committed, that this professor is throwing at me saying this happened in the past semester. This is one other issue that we brought up that was a concern. So I'm already thinking like, okay, so people are having like clandestine meetings behind me uh, expressing concern about me not fitting in. So that was count number two. Same semester,
God,
same
it's just
semester.
it's so uh, meticulously scrutinizing the subtlety of your communication. These are such minor, in my mind, such minor so-called infractions, but they're of great consequence to you. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, and it's kind of at least what I write in my article was like, I don't know, how weak are these ideas that any semblance of just
Right.
oh, because I called it a buzzword. I called anti-oppressive oppression or anti-oppressive a buzzword in that class. And that's what upset these professors, I think, that I called it a buzzword. And I'm going to define it
Uh,
using the dictionary instead. But it's like,
uh,
I call it a buzzword, but is that so, like, so what? Like, there's a lot of buzzwords out there, but do you take issue? It's
uh,
not the holy grail of the profession. It's not,
well,
there's no sacred cow that we can't
well,
challenge, but I call it a buzzword. I get a perfect
you
score.
hoped and assumed, yeah, but this was
Oh
blasphemy.
yeah. Yeah. So that was count number two. Number three was same semester again. This is like I'm getting this in hindsight by this professor over coffee. Same semester, fall of 2022. I'm in another class. Assignment I have to do is create a mock syllabus for our dream course that we want to teach. I'm like, oh, perfect. I want to teach something about the medical model, critiques of it, etc. And so I look at the assignment instructions. There's one thing it asks, which is something to the effect of, in your syllabus that you're creating, write something about how you want to be able to make students feel welcome in an inclusive environment, things like that. Okay, I'm already thinking, well, I think the main way we make students feel included is if we acknowledge all viewpoints. And so I write something about that in my syllabus. I thought that was good. What was the
Oh,
issue though? What
yeah.
was the issue though? And maybe I should give context is all the syllabi across this school of social work all have not only land acknowledgments, we sit on the land of blah blah blah, which is a lot of for me just pure performative stuff. but every single syllabi that we have in this school of social work has a pronoun statement. I have no issues with the pronoun statement. All it says is that we're going to be respectful of using people's pronouns, preferred pronouns, etc. I don't care what people want to identify as, I'll go with it. It's not a big deal to me for the most part. What I didn't do is I didn't include that pronoun statement in my mock syllabus assignment, but that wasn't required. What I had included was my other spiel of we're going to be able to come together, agree to disagree, acknowledge viewpoint diversity. I did not include the pronoun statement, and that was sin number three that was thrown back at me in this meeting with the professor over coffee. So it
Right.
was those three things
Uh-huh.
that had this professor question my seriousness or genuineness about the values of the profession and all that stuff.
I see. An interesting thing when you're not required to do something, but the failure to do it gets you the consequences, the same consequences as if you were required to. And it's you're
That
not in the spirit of the thing if you're not, automatically thinking to include that.
that's
And
one
it,
thing I
it
tried.
wasn't even that you disagreed with it. It wasn't even that
It's
you had a problem with it.
right. What was the omission thing? That's what I tried to emphasize too in my article, where this is the most dispiriting and demoralizing part, where the lack of endorsement that was there was issue taken with that. It wasn't that I was this deranged conservative in class with my MAGA hat on. I'm a pretty quiet student. I just talk whenever I think I know what I'm going to say is valid. I think my peers all respected me. We all got along. I think my research interests were pretty fascinating, and I made some pretty compelling stuff, arguments. I mean, my first article I had published in a journal was about critiquing the medical model, and I had that published as a sole author
Can
while a
can I
grad
just
student.
clarify for some who may not know the context of how you're using the term medical model? You mean as it's applied to, say, psychotherapy and social work. The medical model in medicine is fine,
Yeah, yeah, we
right?
can make that distinction.
Right.
Yeah,
We're
the
not
medical model of mental
wanting to
health.
throw out medicine. We're just talking about how it's misapplied in these other fields. Yeah,
Yes, the biomedical model of mental health is the way we can describe it. Although, funnily
yeah.
enough, I should bring this as an anecdote as well. This is just something that I think was so ridiculous. I remember vividly in one class, we were having just like a pair discussion with our peers, and I don't know what the topic was, but I remember my classmate, I'm not going to name any classmates, but I remember one of my classmates everybody knew my research interests and the psychiatric diagnoses and things like that. But talk about, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I remember this peer of mine said something to the effect of like, yeah, we know that, diagnosis is this really white thing, this white centered thing. And I'm like, what the f are you talking about? Like, what? Oh, I didn't say that. I thought it, but that's just kind of a glimpse of
Uh-huh.
in anything that is like bad has to be
It's
attributed
white.
to whiteness, which is a whole
Yeah,
other
yeah.
specialty in the field that I think is just asinine.
So how did this develop further? I mean, in your article, and I encourage people to read it, especially if you have any interest in this kind of thing. Toward the end, you provide a lot of more little details of things that happened that weren't in the narrative of your story. But I don't know that we finished the story yet. I mean, where did this eventually
Oh,
go?
that's right. Yeah, there's the one like the critical turning point was that. Yeah, that's right. The critical most I don't know, jaw-dropping turning point was so that meeting happened in after the new year. The spring semester of 2023 hadn't begun yet. And so I leave that meeting. I have a good friend who is in a in a dean role within the college under which the school falls under. I reach out to this good friend slash, he's a dean there. I tell him like, dude, this has been happening. Um, you know, I, I I said, let me get I think my next step will be let me get all of this in writing to make sure I understood what that meeting was about, um, which ends up becoming the snippets that I include in this article verbatim,
Mm-hmm.
de-identified, but verbatim. And so I'm already kind of rattled. I enter the spring semester. It's my last social work class that's required. This
Mm-hmm.
professor nicely, sends us a survey saying, you know, tell me anything I need to know about you, preferred learning style, anything else. This is a different professor. And so I go to the CSU, the Colorado State University website. I find a link that says something to the effect of student academic freedom. I just copy and paste that link. It's from CSU. I copy and paste that link into the survey, and then I just say something to the effect of, I hope this is something that can be respected and honored. I submit the survey, and like maybe a week or so later, I get an email from that professor of this class, CCing the professor who grilled me for 2 hours, saying something else to the effect of, thanks for completing the survey. I know you've been having conversations with Professor A, is how I call this person, Professor A about social justice. I'm CCing Professor A as we think that academic freedom can look like a bunch of different things. The email is copied and pasted in the article I got published. Um, why don't the three of us have a meeting together to discuss what you mean? And so I get this email. I'm like, hell no. I reach out to this dean again. He loops in the graduate school, the overseeing body. Another dean or the main dean gets involved. They intervene within like 24 hours, 48 hours. They have a meeting with Professor A and other high-ranking folks in the School of Social Work. And essentially, from then on, it's kind of like at least at best lukewarm interactions. We never have that meeting, but it's just lukewarm interactions at best. They don't really give a shit about me from what I can tell. I raised too much hell by getting graduate school involved and all that kind of stuff. But they immediately, it sounds like at that point, got them off my back. Um, but I could tell it was at best lukewarm interactions because throughout 2023, I had a second article published in an academic journal as a sole author, and I was the lead editor of those two books you mentioned that, from what I've heard, is a pretty rare thing for graduate students. Had those three things published, two books and an article, and I'm still trying to keep a professional collegiate relationship with them. I let all these professors know, hey, just so you know, like I got this published in case y'all want to, celebrate it. It's a cool thing. Maybe my peers can read some of the stuff. And I remember I let Professor A know about that in an email. Literally, the response I get was, "Congrats!" Exclamation mark. That's it. Nothing else. So that's how I could tell that, like, yeah, you guys just don't like me anymore. This is just like
Yeah.
it's
Well,
it's obvious.
yeah. Was the final sin, the final straw, you copy and pasting this statement about academic freedom, and that implies
Yeah.
a challenge to what has been going on. And maybe that was just, you're now a heretic. You've gone too far.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that was the final straw for me, for sure. The three that were
Hmm.
mentioned in the meeting with coffee over coffee, those were the three things. And then the academic freedom thing was like a week or two later that I was at that point, like, I can't, I need to get other folks involved because I'm not going to get ganged up on in any kind of hypothetical meeting with you two versus me. Um, so for me, that was
Hmm.
the final straw where I decided, you know what, if it's going to me over from here on out, I'm fine with it because I can't put up with this anymore. This is just
All right.
clear to me, clear, compelling behaviors that I don't want to put up with anymore as a
All right.
student.
Okay. So, did you finish the program?
No, so I spent all of 2023 down in the dumps for the most part. I couldn't, well, I did. I was able to finalize a committee for my dissertation, but it got to the point where
Well, that was
it's just hard to.
I remember reading that was a bit of a challenge because nobody would sit on your committee. You had to go out of state or something to find somebody.
Yeah, it was already a small faculty as it is, the size of it, and a few folks were like, "I can't. I'm too busy. I have too many things on my plate." When I told my advisor this, my advisor was like, "That's really rare and odd." The reason my advisor responded that way is my advisor was on sabbatical the entire time all this crap was going down. So I purposefully kept my advisor out of the loop to not get this person involved. But my advisor thought that was really rare and odd, not typical of faculty. And
Hmm.
so I knew a colleague, not a, I guess a colleague, maybe a friend, another social work professor out of Florida State. I liked his writings, his ideas. He's fiercely critical of the medical model. I was like, "Hey, do you want to be on my committee? I can't really fill it out." He agreed, so we got that set up. But it was that was another thing in the round throughout 2023 where it's like, even some, I'm like kind of a black sheep now. Nobody wants to touch me. Um, and so 2023 was just kind of demoralizing. I still powered through. That's when I got the two books published at the end of the year, as the lead editor. And then 2024 rolls around. I am wrapping up my final semester of coursework, spring of 2024, so last year now. So around this time last year, I'm wrapping up the semester, turning in final assignments, and I'm also starting a new job in the clinic setting of the community mental health scene. And I am working full time again, you know, 30 some clients a week, back to back, in the belly of the beast of the medical model, but I love it. And I I I I haven't mentioned anything to anyone. I tell my partner, my significant other, that I'm really liking my job, and she just makes this like pretty casual comment of like, "Yeah, you seemed a lot happier now since you started this job." I'm like, "Damn, she's right. That's a good point." And so I make the hard decision. I wrap up the semester. Last summer was supposed to be the preliminary exam, which is like a 40, 50 page paper where you lay out your research proposal, the literature, how you plan to address your topic in a dissertation. So it's a test, pass, fail. And before I even dive into it, because this the start of the semester is where you I would start to flesh that out with my committee. I think about it and then I decide, I don't feel connected to anybody in this program. My committee is so-so. There's some people on my committee that were involved in this whole fiasco, so I'm already kind of like a little wary of some people. I'm happy, obviously, doing the clinical work, even in the belly of the beast of the medical model, but obviously I'm not feeling any kind of purpose out of the PhD program. So I make I thought it was at first a hard choice, and after in hindsight, I have zero regrets. I decided to withdraw from the program around the start of the summer of 2024 last year. So no, I did not finish. I got coursework done.
Okay.
It was all but dissertation.
Okay.
Um, but no
All right.
regrets.
And it was your that choice based on how miserable you had been through the whole ordeal and your anticipation that as you went into a dissertation, you would just be dragged through more of the same? I mean, is that
I kind of like I just at that point well, other factors. I mean, one was dissertation itself can be a year to 4 or 5 years. That's a whole other thing that I needed to keep into mind where I'm done with coursework, but just to be affiliated with the school that I feel no connection with for at least another year just did not sound appealing to me
all
whatsoever.
right?
That was one thing. The other thing was there was no more funding. And so I was like, do I want to take out more student loans to pay for another 1, 2, 3, 4 years of grad school? And then I thought to myself, okay, in the industry I'm in, having a PhD, I don't think would benefit me that much more doing the clinical work I'm already doing. I had interests but that's at the start of the PhD program. I had interests of maybe one day wanting to teach. Once I'm in it, I'm seeing like I don't think I could teach in any school of social work if this is how most of them may be. I don't think anybody would even want me to be there because I'd be
Yeah,
the
yeah.
I wouldn't fit in whatsoever. So teaching was out of the
All
equation. So
right.
all those things combined, I figured,
Okay.
cost benefit analysis, not worth it.
All right. Yeah. What do they call it? The sunk cost? I mean,
Sunk cost fallacy.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So you decided not to fall for that. Okay. Well, I
yeah,
imagine
exactly.
that you were both relieved, but perhaps also disappointed. You sunk a lot of cost into that, and with some aspirations that weren't realized, and that must have been disappointing on
A
some
little
level.
bit. Yeah, a little
Yeah.
bit. I do give them credit as they should have for at least helping because I walked away, I think, with some my writing skills got sharpened quite a bit. I got a lot more informed in how to just, devour some research, appraise it, critically appraise it, things like that. So I have those
Uh-huh.
skills more so now than I did before I
Mm.
was in the
All
program.
right.
So I
Uh-huh.
give them all the credit for helping me with that. Um, a bit disappointed, yeah, sure, maybe a tinge of it, but I tell myself I could always go back in the future, and if I go back in the future, it may be a different program, not social
Well,
work
that's
anymore,
what I was
maybe
wondering.
philosophy or something.
Is this going to persist for the next 10, 5, 10, 15 years, or is it going to change? I'm hopeful that it will change to some degree. Yeah.
Hopefully.
And
Well, maybe other
you're,
schools and programs, but not mine.
yeah. Where you really get your satisfaction, though, it sounds like, is in the clinical work, and you're
Yeah.
well equipped to continue doing that. And so it's not like you've been deprived of career because of this. Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah,
Have my license
yeah,
to fall back on in my master's.
yeah. Okay, well, thanks. I had written down a few things I was curious about that you mentioned in your article that are maybe a little more philosophical or conceptual. But you talk about academic telos, right? And
Right.
the difference between a telos of truth and a telos for activism, and you cite Jonathan Haidt, and you talk about um, it's like you don't propose that one has to choose, that maybe there's a way that these can coexist, but the question is, what's the flavor of truth and what's the flavor of activism, right? And
Right.
I found that a very interesting frame. How would you describe the flavor of truth and the flavor of activism in your program?
Yeah, that's where that was a fun paper to write because the Haidt proposed that tension, that truth versus social justice, and then um you know being in the program for a bit, I was thinking like, well, that's an interesting argument that he proposes. What would be and then as I'm in the program, I'm thinking back. I don't agree with it, but I'm thinking back and I'm thinking like I think both were existing already in my program. But so and this is where I think people can get, I don't know if they can get tripped up or not, but and what I write about in my article, I don't name it, but just how does one describe this compilation of ideas that are kind of that have taken over university settings, um, in a pretty precise, compelling way. I think the pejorative thing now that people just throw with anything they disagree with is, this is all just woke stuff. I think back in the day, maybe that was helpful at that point, but I think now it's been kind of bastardized as a term for some people to like. For example, I was on Facebook a couple of days ago, and I saw an acquaintance post about bashing this show called The Pit on HBO. It's a medical drama. I kind of like medical dramas. Uh, I this whole time I've been thinking it was pretty damn good. Like it's a really good show. I like it a lot. I don't think I took any issues with any of it. Maybe one or two things where I was like, oh, this feels like an insertion of identity politics, but that's it. And then this acquaintance who's presumably more conservative in nature was like, this is a whole woke bullshit show and all that. And so that's where I'm like, I now it's just used like a I disagree with you. So it's well, so that's where I think it gets gotten kind of
Uh-huh.
lazy. And
Uh-huh.
so now I have another paper I've been working on for a bit that I can talk to as well, where about the medical model too. And so for that paper, because I want to try to make it a pretty strong argument. I went back to some of the books, some of the research, some of the literature, and I've been able to kind of distill down, okay, so if I'm not defining it as woke in my original article, I'm saying it's undefinable. I have to be able to put a term to it at some point. And so, yeah, in the grand scheme of things, I think the one that has the most cachet now is what's called CSJ, critical social justice, as like this umbrella term
Yeah,
that's found
right.
in the literature.
That's the
And so
flavor of truth.
that's the
That's the
flavor.
flavor.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the flavor
Okay.
of truth.
Right.
And so that automatically produces a certain flavor of social justice, which is how do we achieve equity and, equality for everybody, etc. That's where
Mhm.
anti-oppressive research, I would argue, comes into play too, where that's package deal with critical
Right.
social justice ideas.
Right. So is there an alternative flavor of truth and an alternative flavor of activism that is less
Well,
problematic in your mind or
I don't
more
know.
helpful?
I mean that's something that I would have to ponder a bit some more on. I mean, it's something that I
Okay.
think people in the field, professors, philosophers can debate about to no end. I just remember, and I give this person, he's become like a good colleague now. He's still at CSU, um, in the library sciences in the library itself. I had helped start up a heterodox academy campus community on campus at CSU throughout all of this nonsense. And I remember we had this discussion amongst me and maybe 10 or so professors and staff there that joined the campus community. And I remember this individual brought up that tension. This is way before I wrote the article. He brought up that tension of like the truth, social justice. And he said, how do you even achieve social justice if you don't know what's true? And I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. And I mentioned that in my article. And so I don't know what the flavor is, but I just think like, and I'm sure there's like some philosophical terms to describe probably what I'm thinking about, but I don't know. It's just like to me,
Well,
if I have to pick now, it's
yeah,
prioritizing truth or at least just developing and accumulating knowledge, knowing that things can be falsifiable, provisional,
exactly.
things
Right.
like that.
Right. Right. That's what
We
I'm thinking. It's not about some alternative truth. It's about the process of pursuing truth, and it's about viewpoint diversity, and it's about civil discourse and debate and the gradual accumulation and modification of knowledge or truth as we go, and when it gets clamped down into one version, that's a particular kind of flavor, you know
right.
yeah,
Yeah,
maybe we need
that's a yeah.
we need a jar of jelly beans with all kinds of flavors.
I
Yeah.
like that. That's a good one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it also struck me, I'm curious what you think. Your critique of the medical model as applied to social work and psychotherapy in terms of pathologizing through psychiatric diagnoses and the way that treatment forms around that. And I have a long history of questioning that myself. My first 8 years in the field were spent in a psychiatric hospital. So, yeah, I'm on board with you about that. But it seems that the whole lexicon of diagnostic categories and approaches to treatment proposed by social justice activism are in the same ballpark. They're of the same kind of quality. They're not much different from psychiatric diagnoses in a sense, and that they come to people and kind of enforce this view on them about what's wrong with them and what needs to happen, instead of truly being an inquiry with them. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Are you saying that both spheres operate similarly? Is that what
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
saying?
yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're spot on. Yeah. And it's interesting. I'm going to deviate a little bit and I'll come back to this because the other paper I have right now that I've been revising, I'm gonna resubmit it to a journal. It got rejected because it was too partisan. I was essentially just lumping critical social justice with left-leaning folks. And so I took that feedback and I was like, you know what, I need to make it more precise. And but what I'm making the argument in that article is that critical social justice folks and ideologies and philosophies are being swindled by the medical model and have swallowed it up in a hypocritical, paradoxical way without really knowing the controversy surrounding it, but solely because it's another identity marker that's a part of the whole critical social justice ethos.
Hmm,
And it's
interesting.
another way to kind of like, well, one of the books I really like that that I think I cite quite a bit in this article is Musa Al-Gharbi. He's a sociologist. He wrote "We Have Never Been Woke," I think is what it's called. Came out at the end of last year, and
Okay.
he coined this term called symbolic capitalists. And essentially, what he's talking about with that term is the elite, the academicians, the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, etc., who say they're for minorities, who say they're for disadvantaged folks, and embody those ideas by virtue of adopting or advocating for certain identity markers. Um, and I think he argues, though, with some pretty secondary effects of you want it for clout, like you want it because you want to be seen as on the good side of history. You want to be seen as like I'm, you know, virtuous and stuff like that. And so what I'm making the case for in my article is that psychiatric diagnoses is just another identity marker that's been swallowed up by critical social justice activists. But if they knew the history of the medical model of mental health,
Okay.
it's low-hanging fruit. They would be
All
wanting
right.
to
Okay.
bash it, but they swallowed it
All
up.
right. All right. I'm curious, what in the medical model or the psychiatric diagnostic categories has the social justice activism swallowed up? Are they
Neurodiversity.
neurodiversity? Okay, so
Yeah.
that would be one. All right.
So if anybody wants to read a book about this topic, one of my favorite authors and writers of all time, he's a psychiatrist out in the UK. I just got his book a couple days ago, Searching for Normal by Sammy
Okay.
Tamimi. Um,
Um,
a new approach to understanding mental health, distress, and neurodiversity. He's one that has written a lot about this topic. Um, in if anybody wants to look up another pair that's written critically about the neurodiversity movement, you know, I don't know if your folks are informed about Mad in America as the website, but there's in y'all's
uh,
land, Mad in the UK is yours,
oh yeah, yeah.
right?
I
Mad in the UK.
do we have
Uh,
Mad in the UK? Yeah, I read Mad in America back in early I don't know 2000 and whatever. Yeah, I
yeah,
forgot
yeah. So
the author's name. He's a journalist. Yeah,
Robert Whitaker.
Robert Whitaker. Yeah, yeah, right.
So Mad in the
Yeah.
UK, because in y'all's part of the world, Mad in the UK. These two people did a series on neurodiversity. Lucy Johnstone and John, I think is his first name, John Crombie. So if somebody wants to look it up, neurodiversity, Mad in the UK, Johnstone Crombie, they did like a four-part series on the idea of neurodiversity. And so people, if they want to go down the rabbit hole of neurodiversity, read some of Sammy Tamimi's work as well. I think it's become clearer and clearer as these ideas are evolving that neurodiversity as this umbrella term is just another thing being swallowed up by CSJ. And what's under neurodiversity? That's a debatable thing because I think ADHD is one of them, so-called ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, the neurodevelopmental stuff. But what Lucy Johnstone and Crombie argue is it's expanding even more to where some are advocating for, you know, actual neurological issues, dementias, to fall under this neurodiversity term, this umbrella
Sure,
term.
sure, yeah. Or
Um,
even,
and
serious so-called these where we get to diagnostic categories in language, but we could talk about borderline personality disorder or bipolar, I mean, whatever we want to call it, there are things that are going on that aren't just, they aren't just different. I mean, in my mind,
Right,
they're problems, whatever you want to call them.
right. Yeah, so it's expanding, and I don't know who's pushing these things. I'm sure it's just a compilation of people, but the ideas are the umbrella term is expanding, swallowing up more and more and more. But again, the whole time, and this is the argument I'm trying to make in this paper I'm revising, if people only knew about the history of them, they would be living. So the case I try to make in this article is that people in my camp, critical of the medical model, we're a small group. We're probably like we people think we're probably conspiracy theorists in some levels. We push it back on big pharma, etc. Whatever. Whatever progress we were making, I think has just been wiped out because of the critical social justice folks
Hmm.
who are like, oh, cool, another identity marker, psychiatric labels, I'm chronically borderline, etc. I'm like, God damn
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
all
yeah,
the
yeah.
effort we were doing, I think it's just
Uh,
been wiped out because of you guys. That's the argument I'm
all
trying to
right.
make in my article.
Okay, all right. Well, I look forward to reading that. And
Yeah,
my sense, it's probably there have been different expressions of it, but this challenge of the medical model in psychiatry goes back, fairly early in my career. I was aware of people who approached, this people like Thomas Saz or even Michael
yeah.
Foucault, and this
Hmm.
idea that medicine was some kind of oppressive system, and yeah,
That goes back way
at
back for
least,
sure. R.D.
yeah.
Lang is another one, I think.
Yeah, R.D. Lang. I had the opportunity to meet him
Oh,
once.
cool.
He came to visit us. I was working with an outfit, working with people, highly disturbed people, and he was friends with the director of our program and came and paid us a visit. Stayed for a few days. Yeah,
That's
he was a
awesome.
he was a character, man. He was a character.
I think
Yeah,
everybody was back then.
yeah, yeah. R.D. Lang. Yeah.
Well, can I
Uh,
ask you a question, Michael?
yeah. Shoot. What do you want?
I'm kind of curious of your thoughts on the medical model too, because I think when we checked in briefly a week or two ago, I
Hmm.
think you conveyed that you're kind of in the same camp, but there was like a but there, like that there's still something there, I think is maybe something you said.
Well, okay.
What do you think? What are your thoughts about it?
Well, if I go back to when I first felt critical of it, it was when the medical model was reducing mental health disorders or psychiatric disorders to brain diseases. This was
Right,
something going wrong in the brain, and if that's the case, then what we need is medicine. We
right,
need to change the brain's chemistry, and that just seems so short-sighted to me. That the brain is the physical substrate of the mind, and we're embedded in an environment and we have social relations. And I started to learn about integral theory, or the integral model, which involves four quadrants. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Ken Wilber, but there's and to simplify the language, we have a mind, we have a body, we have a social reality and interpersonal relationships, and we live in an environment. And so I started to gravitate to the biomedical, the biopsychosocial model
yeah,
instead of just the medical model. So I initially I kind of reluctant to include the medical part because it seems
yeah.
so uh, aggressive, But I think that it has a place to play, but it has to sit in its own spot and not take over the show. Um, and I think for some people, um, some kind of word diagnosis is some kind of language that tells them this is, what's going on can be helpful. For many, it's just a stigma, or
Yeah.
it pathologizes them to a degree that they can't explore what's going on. They just want to cure it. So there's but I have seen for some people having a word, you know, helps. And
Right.
if it's a diagnostic word, then it relates to literature or support groups or resources that people can access. Um, so,
Yeah.
but there's a danger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's been the toughest cookie for me to crack to try to make sense of to push back on that idea because absolutely I think I've had that numerous times with clients where if their psychiatrist said they had OCD, it's just it makes sense to them. It's such a relief. So, but this is where I think it is okay to get more philosophical and nuanced with it because I would imagine 9 times out of 10, I'm thinking, well, that's not a valid label in general. And I'm thinking, okay, how is the client getting relief from this label? 9 times out of 10, I'm assuming the client is thinking this label is explaining the cause of why I'm struggling.
Well,
It's a
yeah,
causal thing.
and it shifts the sense of cause from I am to I have. And if I
Yeah,
have, then I'm separate from what I have instead of, I'm doomed. This is my identity. This is, defines me to this is something I'm dealing with.
I agree. I think, but that's the interesting part though, man, because I think both have been happening because I think that the common rhetoric I hear from people is I have anxiety is one of them. I think that's just the most ridiculous one. Everybody feels anxiety. So I have anxiety is one of them as an
Uh,
example.
yeah, yeah.
I have. Or I am bipolar. So I think both I am and I have exist a lot. And so I'm still trying to work through that just linguistic thing that people go through. And so the only thing I've come to be able to nicely push back on clients and offer an alternative perspective is what if instead of thinking I am or I have, you tell yourself, client, I am experiencing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the
yeah.
only
No,
thing I've been
yeah,
able to come to.
totally agree. Yeah, no, that's right. And philosophically speaking, that's a move to a phenomenological position
Exactly. Yeah.
rather than conceptually categorize something and then reify it as a thing. You look in, with mindfulness and self-awareness and acute observation of what is actually happening.
Right.
What is my experience? When people tell me I'm depressed or I'm anxious or whatever, I'm like, okay, tell me about that. Do you
Right.
sleep at night? Are
Describe
you
it.
are you eating? What kind of thoughts go with that? How do you
Yep.
feel in your body? What have you been doing? Tell me about your day. Without all of that detail, which is I think more phenomenological, it just becomes a placeholder for a lot of assumptions that miss the
Yeah.
mark in terms of actually meeting people where they are. So yeah.
I agree. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think at least what I've gotten accustomed to when I first meet clients, because I don't know, maybe more than half of them come back to see me because they buy what I'm selling. But what also tell them is, you know, we're dealing with like unobservable, fuzzy thoughts and feelings that we still debate to this day. What are they even? I'm going to be a therapist who is going to forcefully if you're up for it, be in the middle messy gray of all this with you. I'm not going to be black and white and say, oh, it's because of your OCD. Oh, it's because you are bipolar. Those are what I end up telling some clients once I have a good relationship with them and they
Hmm.
kind of are on the
Hmm.
same page with me is
Uh,
that's very lazy thinking. It's such a
yeah,
cop out.
yeah,
It's like make an effort as a therapist, as a clinician to try to
sure,
help them make sense of this,
yeah,
but to just reduce it to a diagnostic label, I think is very
uh,
lazy.
yeah. Well, I agree, and I confronted this really early in my career when I was working in the psychiatric hospital. I'd probably been working maybe 3 years, and I had a supervisor that I met with, and I was talking about a client. a young man I was working with. I was talking about my work with this person, and she asked, "What's his diagnosis?" And I said, "Oh, I think antisocial personality disorder or something." And she just said, "Well, you can't do anything with him. He's not going to change." You know,
Oh my God.
that's that. And I thought, "Oh my God, that hmm,
That's it.
really? My supervisor is telling me this. All right,
Wow.
this can't be
Yeah.
true." I have learned that, there are things that can be relatively intransigent and difficult to change, but
Yeah.
her curiosity shut down, her sense of hope for this person shut down. It was just, well, what's the point of me even talking about him then?
Yeah. I think I don't know. Again, I'm maybe just a completely novice in the philosophy world, but I took one philosophy of science class. I really liked it in grad school. That's one good thing I got out of this grad program because it was taught by a philosopher. But I mean, I think that I've heard this term called, and I think I'm hoping I'm going to apply it correctly. Maybe not, but this idea of like epistemic closure, like it just shuts off right there. There's no more
Uh,
curiosity, as you said.
Epistemic
There's
closure,
no
yeah.
we don't need to figure it out anymore. Like that's it. That's what the person's got. That's what the person
Uh,
is. We're
uh-huh,
done. And
right.
to be fair, I mean, some people, as far as changing behavior, changing thoughts, etc. Yeah, for some, is there a compelling reason to want to do that? It's up to them as well as clients. Like it's on you. I'm only here to kind of be a guidance in some way. So
Mm,
there is that. But I'm also what I tell clients and friends and colleagues is like using these labels is so antithetical to me because I'm not in the business of wanting people to think
mm,
something's wrong with them. I want them to
right,
get out of a rut they're in, and the labels
right,
themselves by nature are inherently deficit based and
right,
pretty
right,
controversial and flawed. So no, I'm not going to
right.
use those.
Yeah. Well, and I enjoy this part of our conversation, especially because I think we share a lot of views in this, and it makes me feel sad that you experienced what you did in the doctoral program because here they were
Yeah,
confronted with a student who had a passionate interest in this topic, which ought to be part of the flavor of their truth and a part of the flavor of the kind of activism they'd be willing to embrace. If they had supported you and you had been able to complete that, not that you're not going to aren't already going on to do great things, but they could have supported you in kind of
yeah,
following that through. It's a really
I
important. It's an important topic. Yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's
To be
it's
fair,
not it's not antithetical to their position.
right. Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think they ever took issue with my views. I just didn't endorse the
Yeah,
right ones in their minds. It was
yeah,
just so
and yeah,
ridiculous.
yours just, yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it might be that what you were going to discover was that even white people, are oppressed by this.
Yeah, God, that rhetoric is just so, oh man. Yeah. That's one thing I think I remember if it was with me or a buddy of mine in class. Like I tried to maybe it was me that I got some feedback on an assignment I wrote, but I think oh yeah, no, it was that personal statement for the fellowship because in that personal statement with that professor who grilled me for 2 hours, I try to make it clear before the meeting via email saying, I think my research interest will cut across all so-called racial and ethnic groups. I emphasize that all. And then there was a
Right.
back and forth between like, but what about the BIPOC or the or racialized black people and all or Hispanic
Well,
folks? I'm like,
you
no,
might as well
all
have
is what I'm
said
saying.
you might as well have said all lives matter.
Oh, God, I know. Let's get torched for saying that, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, man, that's just yeah. I don't know what else to say about that.
Right.
It's so weird.
Well, is there anything else that you want to say? Anything we haven't explored that you think would be worth sharing with people who tune into my channel?
I think if have them if they want to read my story in detail, check out my article, but also the special issue that it's a part of. I think there might be about 2 months left where they're all free or open access, so people can just download them, save them. After that,
Okay.
the paywall goes up, from what I heard.
All
So
right.
check out
Okay.
mine, check out everybody else's. It's a pretty interesting compilation of pieces.
All right. I'll make sure to include links to both.
Okay,
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure, Arnold, and
thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
good luck in everything. Yeah. Good luck in everything.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. So long.